the spike came down. It should have rung out against plasteel or crunched through carbon fiber, snapping the silence of the waste. It didn't. It made a sound like a butcher's cleaver hitting a side of beef, a wet, dense thud that didn't belong on a planet made of dead machines. The vibration didn't stop at the handle. It traveled up Cale's arms, rattling his bones, settling deep in his chest. The ground beneath him heaved, not like an earthquake, but like a rib cage expanding for a breath. For a second, the toxic fog stood still. The wind died. The mountains of scrap metal surrounding him seemed to lean in, listening. But before the heartbeat, before the ground turned to flesh, there was only the rot. Necro Prime was where the galaxy flushed its sins. It wasn't a world. It was a landfill the size of a gas giant, a graveyard for the wars the High Council pretended never happened. The sky was a permanent, bruised purple, choked by a smog layer so thick it blocked the stars. Down here, in the trenches of Sector Zero, the air didn't just smell, it had a texture. It tasted of battery acid and old copper, coating the back of the throat with a chemical film that water couldn't wash away. Rain fell in sheets of black sludge, oil mixed with fallout, slicking the mountains of rusted hulls. To the north, the skeletal remains of a Titan-class dreadnought clawed at the clouds, its cannon barrels drooping like wilted flowers. To the south, endless dunes of shattered mechs stretched into the haze. The only sound was the squelch of toxic mud and the distant, rhythmic thumping of atmospheric processors that had failed 3 centuries ago, beating like a dying heart. Cale was a speck of organic matter in a world of decay. He was 25 standard years old, but looked 40. Inside his hazard suit, he was a withered thing. The suit itself was a patchwork of scavenging failures. Duct tape held the elbow joints together, and the seal around his neck was reinforced with dried industrial epoxy. Every breath was a labor. His rebreather unit, a bulky box strapped to his chest, let out a wheezing hiss with every cycle. The indicator light on his wrist blinked, a lazy, rhythmic red. 5% oxygen. Maybe an hour of air if he didn't panic, if he didn't move too fast. But he had to move. He wasn't digging for survival anymore. That ship had sailed 3 days ago when the Scavenger Guild transport lifted off, leaving him standing in the muck. Quota not met, the drone had chirped. Contract terminated. They left him to die, not because he was useless, but because he was cheaper to replace than to feed. Desperation had burned out days ago. What kept him swinging the heavy excavation spike now wasn't hope. It was spite. A cold, sharp, crystalline hatred for the organized galaxy. He dug because stopping meant proving them right. He dug because if he was going to die, he wanted to die, holding something valuable enough to buy the guild commander's life 10 times over. Sector Zero was cursed. That's what the old-timers said, the ones who had lost limbs to unstable reactors or had their lungs turned to jelly by leaking bioweapons. They said the ground here was hungry. Cale didn't care. Curses were stories for people who had options. He stood waist-deep in a subterranean mud pit, the walls oozing a phosphorescent green slime. He raised the rusted spike, his muscles screaming. His hands were raw hamburger inside his gloves, the blisters popping and reforming with every swing. He brought the tool down. Thwack. Mud sprayed his visor. He wiped it with a forearm, smearing the grime. Swing. Impact. Breathe. Wheeze. His vision blurred at the edges. The lack of oxygen was making his extremities numb. A cold knot tightened in his gut, the body's way of saying it was shutting down non-essential systems. He was going to die here. He was going to be just another layer of sediment in the geological history of trash. Not yet, he grunted, the voice cracking in the dry, recycled air of his helmet. He raised the spike for one last heavy blow. He aimed for a protrusion in the mud, something that looked like the edge of a fusion drive. He put his weight into it, letting gravity do the work. Thud. The sound from the beginning returned. It wasn't metal, it was dull. Wet. Cale froze. The vibration hummed through his boots. He fell to his knees, ignoring the warning chime of his suit integrity alarm as the toxic mud rose to his chest. He began to claw at the sludge with his hands. He shoveled away layers of grime, old wires, and jagged plastic. He expected rust. He expected the gray dullness of titanium or the white ceramic of a medical pod. What he found was black. Obsidian black. It wasn't metal. It had textured, tiny, interlocking plates like the skin of a deep-sea predator. Cale stopped digging. He reached out, his gloved fingers trembling, and brushed the surface. It was warm. On a planet where everything was dead and cold, this heat was shocking. It radiated through his glove, and then he felt it. A pulse. Slow, rhythmic, deep. Thump. Thump. It synced with the pounding of his own heart. Cale stared at the exposed patch of skin. It wasn't a wreck. It was a hibernation pod, or a womb, or a coffin waiting for a resident. The spike had gashed the surface, a shallow wound in the black chitin that was oozing a thick, violet liquid. Any other scavenger would have run. A biosign on Necroprime and one of two things: a feral genetically modified weapon or a plague carrier. This was an abomination. Cale looked at his oxygen gauge, 3%. He looked at the wound he had inflicted on the thing beneath the mud. He saw himself in it, buried, forgotten, bleeding out in the dark. He unclipped the plasma cutter from his belt. It had one charge left, enough to cut through a hatch or warm a meal, or cauterize a wound. He didn't think about the guild. He didn't think about safety. The lizard brain took over, recognizing a kin in the darkness. He thumbed the ignition. The cutter flared with a blue-white hiss. "Easy," he rasped, though he didn't know if the thing could hear him. "Easy." He pressed the flame to the gash in the black armor. The violet blood sizzled and sealed. The pulsing beneath his hand sped up, agitated, then calmed. He holstered the cutter and placed both hands flat against the warm, dark surface. He wasn't a man claiming salvage. He was a drowning man, grabbing a lifeline. "They left us both to rot," Cale whispered, the condensation from his breath fogging the glass in front of his eyes. He leaned his forehead against the hull, closing his eyes as the darkness of the pit seemed to embrace him. "Wake up." The mud shuddered. The black surface beneath Cale's hands didn't just vibrate, it contracted. A seam appeared in the chitin, not a mechanical slide of metal on metal, but the wet, tearing sound of a wound being pulled open. It dilated. A sphincter of muscle and dark glass widened, revealing a throat-like passage that exhaled a blast of hot, humid air. Cale didn't hesitate. He scrambled forward, sliding on the slick exterior, and tumbled into the dark. The membrane sealed shut behind him with a wet smack, plunging him into a suffocating gloom. The silence of the outside world vanished, replaced by a deep fluid rushing sound, the noise of blood pumping through massive arteries. Cale fumbled for the light on his suit, but the interior beat him to it. Bioluminescent veins running along the ribbed walls flared to life, casting the space in a sickly, jaundiced yellow. It wasn't a hallway, it was an esophagus. The floor was soft, yielding under his boots like thawing meat. The walls were lined with dripping sacs and exposed muscle fibers that twitched in the stagnant air. The smell hid him even through the suit's failing filters, a thick, cloying stench of ozone and old blood. It was claustrophobic, hot, and terrifyingly alive. He took a step, and the ship reacted. It didn't welcome him. It identified a parasite. The walls rippled. From the ceiling, a cluster of white, gelatinous sacs detached. They hit the floor with heavy splats, unfolding into shapes that mocked the canine form, feaceless, eyeless things made of bone-white cartilage and wet muscle, white blood cells the size of wolves. Cale backed up, his boots slipping on the slime. "No," he croaked. "I'm the pilot." The ship didn't care. Tendrils erupted from the floor, thick as pythons. They lashed around his ankles, jerking him off his feet. He slammed into the soft floor, the breath knocked out of him. A tendril coiled around his throat, squeezing. Another wrapped his torso, pinning his arms. The white shapes loped closer, jaws unhinging to reveal rows of serrated bone. Above, the ceiling pores began to weep, a clear, viscous fluid. A drop hit Kale's faceplate. The plastic hissed and smoked. Acid. Digestion had begun. The oxygen alarm screamed in his ear. Critical failure. The pressure on his throat cut off the blood flow. His vision swam with gray spots. His lungs burned. He was going to be dissolved in the gut of a beast he had just saved. No. The spite flared again, hotter than the acid. Kale stopped fighting the restraints. He couldn't overpower a starship. He had to infect it. He jammed his chin down, hitting the emergency seal release. With a hiss of escaping air, his helmet detached. The atmosphere rushed in. It tasted of copper and electricity, heavy and wet. He gagged, but he sucked it in. He wrenched his right arm free, the suit's servo whining in protest, and grabbed the rusted excavation spike still clipped to his belt. He didn't strike the attacking creatures. He turned the weapon on himself. With a primal grunt, Kale sliced the spike across his own left palm. The glove split. Skin parted. Red blood welled up, bright and fast against the dirt. He slammed his bleeding hand against the pulsing nerve cluster on the wall beside him. Flesh met flesh. Blood met biocircuitry. The connection was instant and violent. It wasn't a handshake. It was a collision. Kale screamed as his nervous system was hot-wired into a mind the size of a city. He didn't ask for control. He didn't beg. He forced his way in. He took every ounce of hunger, every beating from the guild overseers, every night he'd slept in toxic mud, and he shoved it down the neural link. He weaponized his trauma. "Look at me," he projected, his mind tearing at the ship's barriers. "I am not food. I am the hunger." The ship recoiled. The white shapes froze, inches from his face. The tendrils loosened, trembling. The Leviathan tasted the blood. It tasted the rage. It was bitter, sharp, and familiar. The ship was a predator, and it recognized a fellow killer. "I am the brain," Kale thought, the words echoing in the vast dark cathedral of the ship's mind. "You are the body." The ship hesitated. Then it submitted. The acid rain stopped. The white defenders dissolved back into the walls. The tendrils that held him didn't let go. They changed. They softened, fusing with the ports on his hazard suit, weaving into the fabric. The yellow light died. In the darkness, a new color pulsed, deep, angry. Crimson. The floor beneath Kale shifted. He wasn't lying in a gut anymore. He was being lifted. The flesh of the room molded around him, forming a chair, a cradle, a throne. Nerve endings extended from the headrest, sliding into the base of his skull with a sensation like ice water. His physical eyes went blind. His mind's eye blew wide open. He felt the mud pressing against his skin, not his human skin, but his hull. He felt the weight of the trash mountains on his back. He felt the cold fusion core in his chest, thrumming with a power that could crack a moon. Kale grinned, blood trickling from his nose. "Suit up." Outside, the mountain of garbage exploded. Tons of scrap metal, rusted mechs, and compressed waste were blasted into the sky. The ground liquefied. The Leviathan rose from the crater, shedding the debris like water. It breached the surface, a nightmare silhouette against the bruised purple sky. It was sleek, black, and organic, shaped like a prehistoric shark armored in obsidian. It didn't roar. Engines didn't rev. The ship opened its psychic maw and shrieked. It was a sound felt rather than heard, a telepathic shockwave that shattered the glass of every wrecked cockpit within 10 miles. The atmospheric processors in the distance skipped a beat. Kale sat in the center of the nerve bridge, his human body limp, suspended in the embrace of the ship. But his consciousness was soaring. He flexed a thruster, and the ship moved. He focused a sensor, and he saw the curvature of the planet. He was no longer a scavenger. He was the Leviathan, and he was hungry. They didn't come with a roar. They arrived with a tear in the fabric of the dark. 3 distinct pops of displaced air thundered across the scrap fields. High above the smog layer, the clouds parted, burned away by the entry vectors of the purification squad. They were 3 frigates, sleek and dagger-sharp, painted in a blinding sterile white trimmed with gold. Against the brown and gray rot of Necro Prime, they looked like surgical instruments hovering over a gangrenous wound. Kale felt them before he saw them. The Leviathan's sensors weren't radar, they were lateral lines, sensing the displacement of the void. He felt the hum of their fusion cores as a headache behind his eyes. A hologram blossomed directly into his mind, no screen, just a projection on his optic nerve. The commander sat in a bridge that was too clean, wearing a uniform that had never seen dust. He looked at Kale, not with anger, but with the bored disgust of a man stepping on a cockroach. "Abomination detected," the commander's voice echoed, smooth and synthetic. "Scavenger, step away from the beast. Protocol dictates incineration. Make this quick, and your death will be painless." Kale felt the ship's hunger rumble. It wasn't a stomach growl, it was the vibration of a tectonic plate shifting. He looked at the white ships, then at the endless ocean of trash below him, the organized galaxy, the ones who threw him away. He laughed. It was a wet, distorted sound, amplified by the ship's vocal sacs, until it boomed across the valley. "You want to purify this world?" Kale asked. "Start with yourselves." The commander's eyes narrowed. "Open fire." The sky turned white. 3 beams of concentrated holy plasma struck the Leviathan. Kale didn't dodge. He didn't raise a shield. He leaned into it. He willed the ship's skin to shift, instantly growing layers of hyperdense, calcified bone plating over the impact zones. The plasma splashed against the chitin, boiling the sludge on the hull, but the bone held. It blackened, it cracked, but it didn't break. "My turn," Kale whispered. He didn't fire a laser. He retched. The Leviathan's prow split open a jaw, unhinging. Muscles the size of maglev trains contracted, and the ship vomited a stream of pressurized, corrosive bile mixed with void leeches. The physics of the destruction were absolute. The bile hit the lead frigate. The void shields flickered and died, eaten by the leeches. Then the acid touched the hull. The pristine white metal didn't explode, it melted. It dissolved like sugar in boiling water. The frigate's structure collapsed in on itself, the hull liquefying, exposing the screaming crew to the vacuum. They didn't burn, they were digested. The second frigate tried to turn, its thrusters flaring panic blue. Kale pushed the thought. Hunt. The Leviathan surged forward, ignoring inertia. It slammed into the turning ship with the force of a meteor. The impact crumpled the frigate's engine block. The Leviathan didn't stop. It bit down. Hydraulic jaws sheared through the midsection of the starship, snapping the spine of the vessel. Metal shrieked a sound like a dying god before the silence of the vacuum swallowed the wreckage. 2 down. The commander's ship was running. It was already spooling its warp drive, desperate to flee the monster it had come to kill. "No," Kale said. "You don't get to tell the story." He focused on the fleeing heat signature. The Leviathan's secondary weapon primed. From the dorsal ridge, a harpoon launched a massive, bone-spiked tongue tethered by a sinew cable. It crossed the distance in a heartbeat. It punched through the frigate's rear shielding, piercing the engine core. Real. Kale felt the resistance, the strain on the cable, and then the give. He dragged the screaming engine block backward. The commander's face appeared in his mind one last time, eyes wide, mouth open in a plea that never made a sound. The Leviathan's maw covered the view. The transmission cut with a wet crunch. Silence returned to Necro Prime, but the air had changed. It was no longer the smell of rot. It was the smell of fresh meat. The Leviathan floated amidst the drifting debris of the white ships, its tendrils extending to harvest the biomass of the fallen crews. It was feeding. Kyle watched the hull integrity indicator in his mind climb back to 100%. He felt the ship's satisfaction warm his blood. It was a narcotic rush, better than any drug, better than oxygen. He navigated the ship through the cloud of wreckage until he found the only piece of tech worth keeping, the quantum communication array from the flagship. "Connect," he ordered. The Leviathan assimilated the device, fusing wires with nerves. Kale opened a channel, not to a person, but to the public frequency, the emergency band used by every guild, fleet, and trade lord in the sector. He broadcast the image, no face, no manifesto, just the live feed of the burning white wreckage floating in the toxic mud, stripped of its glory, being consumed by the black beast. To the guilds, Kale said, his voice layered with the growl of the ship. To the fleets, to the lords who sit in high towers. He paused, letting the static hiss. You threw us away. You called us trash, but you forgot the first rule of the junkyard. Garbage rots, and rot spreads. The Leviathan turned its head toward the stars, the crimson eyes burning through the smog. We are coming for you. He cut the feed. The adrenaline faded. The battle was over. The silence of the bridge returned. Kale slumped back into the nerve throne. The crimson lights dimmed to a resting pulse. He took a breath, expecting the wheeze of his old rebreather, the taste of stale recycled air. Instead, the air was rich, oxygenated, perfect. He looked down at his body. He wanted to unclip. He wanted to stand up, walk to the airlock, and maybe find a bottle of water. He tried to pull his arm free from the armrest. It didn't move. Kale frowned. He pulled harder. The biomatter that had formed around his suit during the suit-up wasn't just holding him. It had permeated him. The tendrils hadn't just plugged into the suit's ports. They had grown through the fabric, through the skin, weaving into his muscle and bone. He looked at his legs. He couldn't see where the pilot ended and the chair began. The black chitin of the ship had started to creep up his chest, turning his skin into armor. He reached for the release clamp on the back of his neck, the emergency disconnect for the neural link. His fingers brushed against it. The clamp was gone. Smooth, warm bone covered the base of his skull. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. Let me out, he thought. The ship answered, not with words, but with a feeling. A low, purring comfort. Home, it whispered. Whole. Kale looked at the view screen. He saw his reflection in the dark glass. He didn't see a human face anymore. He saw eyes that glowed with the same predatory red as the ship's core. He saw a mouth that didn't look like it was made for smiling, only for biting. He realized then that he hadn't just found a ship. He hadn't just suited up. He had been eaten. The Kale that dug in the mud was dead. The thing sitting on the throne was just the brain of the beast. He looked at the stars again. The panic faded, replaced by that cold, familiar knot in his gut. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was the hunger. It was vast, bottomless, and eternal. He would never be full. He would never be warm. He would only be fed. Kale closed his eyes and leaned back into the flesh of the chair. Course set, he whispered to the empty room. Hunting grounds.